Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's event. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Hannah Stewart. I'm the director of the Counter Extremism Group. We're a small think tank founded in 2020, and we specialise in studying counter-extremism, research and policy. This little lady is Lucy. She's the youngest member of the audience and the only one that I am going to encourage to sleep through tonight's event. This event is our fourth annual public lecture, and it's a great pleasure to be joined tonight by such impressive speakers. Thank you. Professor Sir David Omand is a former permanent secretary of the Home Office and director of GCHQ, and Lord Carlile is a former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And they will be in conversation with Lord Walney, the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption. Our speakers are experts. They bring a wealth of experience on national security, counter-terrorism, and much, much more. And I very much look forward to hearing their views on extremism today and our responses to it. Tonight's discussion is also the flagship event of our Young Leaders in National Security Fellowship, a residential course for young people interested in this area, which we run every year in the first week of September. Lord Carlile and Lord Walney have kindly agreed to be patrons of this year's programme, and with their support, we hope to help the young fellows in their career in this field. I'm really, really delighted to see so many, not just this year's fellows, but also the previous years, the alumni here tonight. And it's been wonderful over the course of today and the last few years to see how you've been getting on in your careers. Some of you have been doing, well, all of you have been doing brilliantly, and I hope we'll be running in 20 years' time and we'll bring you back as speakers. I think really there's just a couple of housekeeping things to say. Tonight's conversation is on the record. We're filming and we'll put it out on our YouTube channel. Feel free to post on social media if you like. And finally, please join me in welcoming our speakers. Thank you.
Well, Hannah and Lucy, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is wonderful to see you. Thank you all for joining this lecture in conversation. I'm delighted to be joined by Sir David and Lord Carlile to talk through a range of issues, which we'll maybe do for, say, half an hour or so, and then let's open up the conversation. And I'm really interested to get your reflections and questions on this. Let me, just before I kick off, add my thanks to Hannah and Catherine and Tom and the team for putting this programme together. It has become stellar and exemplary, I think, in the counter-extremism world. The quality of the people you've been able to attract to stimulate your thinking, and the quality of the fellows, many of whom I see here are on this programme this week, and many graduates, is extraordinary. And it is a testament, may I say, to you, Hannah, the fact that you have been determined to be here, despite the fact that you are in the middle of your maternity leave. I didn't expect to see you. I probably should have done, and I'm delighted that we have and to meet you. But there's rather a lot going on. There's quite a lot that we can talk about. I understand that you've had the pleasure of hearing from Lord Carlile earlier on, and so I'm gonna start with you, Sir David, former permanent secretary of the Home Office, from director of GCHQ, amongst other government roles. Your most recent book, titled How to Survive a Crisis, Lessons in Resilience and Avoiding Disaster. So I suppose an opening question is, how did the government do during the recent riots? What are the lessons that they should take from this?
Well, in my book, and thank you for inviting me this evening, in my book, I say, you know you're in crisis by what I call the rubber levers test. You know, stuff is hitting you, you pull on the levers, and they don't seem to be connected to the real world. And that's when you know you're in crisis. Now, I make a distinction in the book between emergencies, crises, and disasters. So the crisis is poised, and if you've done your investment in resilience, if you anticipated the kind of trouble that might come your way, well, probably not been able to know when exactly it would hit you, but you've done the basics, the disaster becomes a series of emergencies that you know how to cope with. If you haven't done that prior investment, then the crisis slides the other way, and you end up in some form of disaster. Now, if you take that as your framing of your question, I think the authorities did very well.
Yeah.
I helped the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary with the after-action report in 2011, after those very serious riots and looting. And a lot of work was put into, by the police service, by the Home Office, by the prosecutors, into how you would deal with sort of major breakdowns of law and order. So on that score, I think they did well. I think the government backed up the forces of law and order convincingly. One of the lessons that comes out, and I've got in the book, is you do have to act quite decisively from a government point of view. If you let it drift for a little while, it can get out of hand. The best example of that, perhaps, is the Battle of Burn-Tollet Bridge. I'm old enough to remember January 1969, when the Civil Rights March was ambushed by about 100, 150 extreme prods. And there was a riot and people got hurt, and it slid for weeks into a situation where law and order on the streets was lost. And of course, as we know, the IRA capitalized on that. They didn't initiate it. But the government of the day was very slow to recognize the seriousness of the situation. And I think that's my reading of the recent events. You've got to not only act quickly to prevent it running out of control, but you've got to understand very quickly how serious it really is. And in that case, driven by what I can only describe as a hostile ideology.
It is genuine and excellent book, and if you haven't read it yet, go and get it, or do what I did and download it from Audible, read to you in the dulcet tones of the author sitting here, and you bring to life the theory and the practice with vivid examples such as that. I'm really interested in the issue of institutional memory, and it's triggered by what you say. You are old enough to remember. I mean, we were talking before, and you were saying about how you run courses for new intelligence officers and people coming up. Now, the riots were faced by a civil service and a policing and intelligence system with, you would hope, the level of institutional memory it needed, but being led ostensibly by a very new set of ministers. Of course, you had a prime minister who had that level of experience, which was, as former director of public prosecutions, which was acceptable. Nevertheless, the hands-on experience of that team was tested very quickly. Say, what do you think, if you have any reading of how that process worked this time, or previous examples of how you can get the political system up to speed very quickly?
Well, my own personal view is that we're very bad at institutional memory, and we always have been. It's the job of the officials and the police service, police chiefs, for example, to hold the memory, so that when things happen, you can pass on a certain amount of learning, that we tried that before, or you might want to be a bit careful before you jump in and do that, because, and then you can produce some evidence of what needs to be done. The previous administration abolished the Civil Service College, for example.
Yes,
so there is no central training mechanism for the senior civil service. It's done ad hoc. A lot of it is contracted out. I've got nothing against the skill sets of experienced contractors and merchant bankers, but it's not the same as having somewhere that holds that institutional memory. And you only need to look at remember the Ariana Grande concert. And the inquest report and the independent report that was then done on the very difficult time that the responders had, particularly when the fire and rescue service was held outside the perimeter. They weren't able to go in and give help to those who were seriously injured because of a failure in command and control. And that was all exposed. I recommend reading that report. Now, the theory was all there. We had established that when I was Security and Intelligence Coordinator after 9/11. The theory was there, but there were new faces in the police service and the emergency services. They hadn't all trained together. And that was one of the lessons from 9/11, to institute emergency training of the three emergency services together so that they knew how to respond, to introduce the concept of gold command so that you would know who was going to be in charge, and then subordinate silver and bronze commanders. It's a world-beating system, but you have to invest in each generation to teach them how to do it. The armed services do this all the time. It's what they do. It's why they're so good at what they do, is because they take the time to invest in that kind of training rather than throwing people in the deep end. I don't think you can do that with the political class. I don't think ministers are inclined to, or indeed even if they had the opportunity to spend months preparing for the mission, that's not realistic. So that puts an additional onus on the experience of the senior folk in, for example, the police service, the emergency services, the civil service.
Absolutely. And Alex, if you were Home Secretary, if you become Home Secretary at some point in the future, what would you be doing? What are your immediate lessons from last month? What would you think needs to change from here?
Well, we had an exchange in the House of Lords this afternoon. You and I were both present when a government statement made in the Commons yesterday was repeated about the riots. And one question that was raised but was not answered was, what would you do, if anything, about the police service? My starting point would be first of all, I think actually the police did very well in this situation, but it was despite all the cards being stacked against them. Lord Bernard Hogan-Howe, made an intervention in which he revealed, I didn't know it until I heard it this afternoon, that the police in London had 6,000 fewer officers out than in the 2011 riots. I was very surprised by that. I think my starting point would be the police service is very badly organised. We have 43 territorial police forces in England and Wales. So you have the Metropolitan Police, which is huge, and you have the Dyfed-Powys Police. I used to be an MP in Dyfed-Powys Police area, which is good, covers a huge rural area, and is very small. And it makes absolutely no sense to have 43 territorial police forces organised in different ways. Some of them, they find it very difficult to find people prepared to be the chief constables of those police forces. Some of them are very successful with their chief constables. The creation of police and crime commissioners has been largely window dressing. I do not think that many police and crime commissioners have had a beneficial effect of any kind on their police forces. And I say that deliberately on the record in the hope that someone will actually report that.
Do we have any police and crime commissioners in the room? No.
Well, that's a shame. That's a shame.
Okay. Just checking.
And I can give you a model which David I think, would recognise. I was the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation for 10 years, as John said, and counter-terrorism policing has now regionalised itself into 12 regional organisations, and they work extremely well. They are a template for how difficult policing should be organised. I spent some time, it was the time it took to drink a whole bottle of wine, with a new Home Secretary, whom I will not name for obvious reasons, connected with the bottle of wine. And we discussed the organisation of the police. And that Home Secretary, he or she, said to me, I think you're absolutely right about this. I would like to try and reorganise the police. And came back to me and said sometime later, I can't do it. MPs will tell me that if we try to reorganise the police, that will be the end of the world as we know it. Law and order will collapse in Loamshire if we don't have a Loamshire police force. So my starting point for efficiently policing events like this is let's seriously sit down. If we have to have a royal commission because it has to be done by some independent person, let's have one, but let's reorganise the police. On the actual riots, I think we had a perfect combination which rarely takes place in politics, a combination of experience and competence. We happened, by sheer luck, to have a Prime Minister who happens to be a very good lawyer and who was actually there in 2011 and played an important part in the arranging of the prosecution of rioters in 2011 and cooperating with the police. Also, although the riots were very serious, they could have been much bigger. I feared that they would grow much bigger, that they did not. So a little bit of luck and a great deal of competence meant that we were able to deal with it very effectively. I think the judges did very, very well, both the district judges in the Magistrates' Court and the circuit judges in the Crown Courts, and I better declare an interest. My wife is a circuit judge in a Crown Court, though she didn't deal with any of those cases because we were on holiday at the time. The judges are supremely trained, largely through the efforts of Professor David Omand, who's sitting up there. They are very well trained these days, much better than used to be the case. And as a result, I think the judges played their part very well too. So within what was actually days, what could have been a long-lasting national crisis was resolved. And it's now being quietly dealt with day by day in courts where judges are passing sentences which necessarily have a deterrent effect. And of course, if some of those sentences are too long, there's always the Court of Appeal to sort it out afterwards. Actually, the most important thing is what happens immediately after the event. It has illustrated some flaws in our legal system. Those cases have come before the Crown Courts in days or weeks. But Crown Court judges all over the country are listing cases, including, for example, rape cases in which the alleged victims, some of whom are real victims, possibly most of whom are real victims, were very young at the time of the offence. And they're listing those cases now for 2026. That's absolutely not acceptable. But we at least have done something which has given a slightly better reputation to the legal system. Professional advocates like me are prone to say to each other in the robing room at Crown Courts, well, they hate us lawyers until they need us, that is. Well, I think this has been a demonstration of our legal system at its best.
You've had a situation since at least 2010 where the judicial system has been steadily eroded funding. The government came in, and we should remember that it was the literal day one crisis that the Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer inherited of prisons that were already full to bursting points. The riots then broke a number of weeks later. I mean, presumably, if you are Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, and the Prime Minister thinking ahead to the autumn budget with all of the spending pressures, funding to the judiciary has gone several notches up the priority list.
Well, the funding of the Crown Courts is shameful. Many Crown Courts are physically falling apart. The buildings are not repaired properly. The security of judges is important, but it's not getting the level of importance it needs. Jurors are not in all courts kept separate from witnesses and other people walking into the building. There are all sorts of practical problems. But those can, and I believe will be solved, if this government gets hold of efficiency issues. I don't think that the Crown Courts need a huge amount of extra money. They need a huge amount of extra management and organisation so that the same money can be spent more effectively. But
I was just going to say, collective memory. When I left the Home Office, we had the end of the last century, I think it was 64,000. We're now touching 90,000. There has not been a commensurate increase in the level of crime in the country.
When I was an MP in the 1980s, we were shocked and horrified by there being 45,000 people in prison.
And of course, what has made it worse is the running down of the probation service.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're not able to do work either in prison or afterwards on release under supervision, then it's simply the same people going in and out of prison again and again and again. It's a huge failing.
You and I are the oldest people in this room, David, and I don't think, well, there's Alan West there as well, Admiral Lord West, but I don't think any of the three of us would say that the country is a more lawful place now than it was when there were 45,000 people in prison.
I think that's true. Coming back to Alex's remarks about the police service, another little sort of anecdote. When Jack Straw and I were in the Home Office, we had a Lancaster House conference on the future of the policing service, and we came very close to agreement with the police chiefs for the sort of major reorganisation of the kind that Alex had. Now,
Jack Straw, former Home Secretary under Tony Blair, for those who, some of you may not have been alive and may also not have read your history. So.
Sounded like the old man of the sea here. But the point was we did get them on board for major reorganisation, and that would be accompanied by the introduction of a compatible communication system, which eventually happened after much delay, airwave. But what scuppered it in the end was the Treasury, lack of money, because it costs an enormous amount of money to reorganise, retrain, rebrigade people. If you're doing a major restructuring, the experience of Police Scotland, thankfully, I think they've now settled down, but they had a pretty ropey start, bringing the police, 8 police services together in one Police Scotland service. I mean, look, the jokes about 43 shades of blue may raise a smile, but it was true. And in fact, if you were really going to create a new organisation, you have to be prepared to invest in it. And it was just that point in the economic cycle when we just didn't have the additional resource to put into it.
So we've talked about some of the physical aspects of security, the need for police force, a functioning judiciary, police, a prison system that has sufficient capacity. Let's talk about the ideology behind it, which is driving, I think, many of our fellows. Now, you've got this the riots and other activity happening in the context of the new government, the new Home Secretary Yvette Cooper announcing what is, I think, intended to be a 100-day sprint review of counter extremism strategy, which, to my mind, is much needed, but is ambitious, given this is a policy, a strategy which is largely founded on difficulties that have been created since the last attempt to do one, about 2015, I guess, under the David Cameron government. At top level, there is the sort of quite crude barometer. Do we Do we as a state, as politicians, focus on far right, Islamism, far left? Do we get the balance right? I'm sure that will be mixed up. But what other factors? I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But also, what other factors do they need to be thinking about if you're going to create a coherent counter-extremism policy where we have not had one of late?
Well, I accept responsibility after 9/11 for putting together the nation's counter-terrorism strategy contest. And you have to be clear about what is the objective. So what, counter-extremism, to what end? What is, now, when we looked at counter-terrorism, in a sense, it all boiled down to one word, which was normality. So if we could demonstrate that people were able to go about their normal lives freely and with confidence, we were prevailing and the terrorists were losing. Because if the nation is not being disrupted, upset, people are not being put in fear, then the terrorists, the extremists, are going nowhere. So having fixed on that, as you then, how do you translate that into a series of plans? Since I'm an academic, I can cite to you Ashby's law of requisite variety, the first law of cybernetics. So if you have a complex dynamic situation that you want to control, you have to have at least as many policy instruments as there are different vectors of trouble coming in to disturb your system. So it's a great mistake just to say, pick on prevent or any one single dimension, which is why when we put the counter-terrorism strategy together, we used the risk equation borrowed from the City of London and the insurance industry, so that to reduce the risk to the public, which is what you're trying to do to keep conditions of normality, you need to reduce the likelihood of bad things happening, reduce your vulnerability to those bad things. When they do happen, deal with them swiftly and effectively, and minimize the length of disturbance to the normal workings of the economy and society. So those are your factors. Then for each of those, you need to work out, well, how are we going to do it? So that's where you need, in taking the current circumstance, you need really reliable, good, secret intelligence on those who are fomenting trouble. You need to be able to gather evidence of law breaking and put them in front of a court. We've been extremely successful at that with counter-terrorism. Get convictions. You need, and this is where prevent comes in, to think about how could we minimize the impact of these voices on the vulnerable, particularly given social media these days, which of course we didn't have at the time when contest was put together. Then reduce your vulnerability. And this takes you into some of the considerations of resilience, hardening education, for example, in relation to social media, and then deal with the initial impact of these things. As you've said, the riots recently were dealt with pretty effectively, but you've got to prepare for that and be prepared. And Alex's point about the police service and the hand-to-mouth way in which reinforcements are sent round. So there's probably work to be done on that agenda. And then can you minimize the time of disruption before you get it all back to normal? Some of that's at community level, sweeping up the broken glass. Again, very good examples of community spirit which can be encouraged by government and by charitable organizations, and investing in the resilience of the infrastructure so that these guys can't knock us off course by, for example, turning their violence against the critical infrastructure on which we depend. I mean, that's a kind of lecture in miniature, but that's how you go about structuring the problem. And then for each of those, you can start to think of things to do and how much would it cost, how long would it take. And in counter-terrorism, we've been through, I think, about 4 refreshes now with new sets of plans. When we started, the extreme right was not really an issue. We worried that a terrorist attack could provoke communal violence, but it wasn't really, there was very little evidence of organization. Since then, in the succeeding 20 years, we've had the growth of sort of extreme populism. We've got the replacement theories sculling around the internet. We've got seriously evil influencers pushing out messages which are essentially ideological in tone. So it's, I think, a mistake to look back on the recent events and just simply talk about thugs and yobs and so on. It's not. There is actually some serious international thinking, which I find totally malign. It's foreign to us.
Well, it leads me very on to what was going to be my next question of, do you think we need to do more, and I suppose then it means in what ways, on identifying, calling out, countering malign foreign influence on our politics, on our security system, and those who are seeking to fan extremism? Obviously, this is something, and I'm interested in your insight as former head of GCHQ, and obviously someone who is not formally not connected in that way, but clearly still has a very clear insight into how the picture has been changing.
I come back to the law of requisite variety. Don't think there's going to be one single set of things you can do. There's no magic bullet. So you're going to have to work. We are all going to have to work at the community level, promoting cohesion, promoting interfaith dialogues. We're going to have to work, apply the legislation in relation to the internet and the internet companies so that we can actually prosecute when necessary, and certainly fine companies who are not upholding their own codes of conduct and allowing inflammatory material, which is unlawful, to be passed. And we'll have to do it with other countries, because this isn't something we can sort out ourselves.
Well, my metaphor for terrorism is that it's not a state of mind, it's not a state of affairs. The metaphor is that it's like a very complicated disease which spreads and changes, and whenever you think you've treated the main symptoms, it's gone to somewhere else in the body politic in this case. And, you know, I'm going to name check 2 other people in the room now. When I became independent reviewer of terrorism legislation on the day of 9/11, as it happens, it was much less complicated than it is today. During that time, Suzanne Rain, who's sitting in the middle, was the director of JTAC, the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which is an extremely important collegiate body involving all the relevant players. And Jonathan Hall, who's sitting at the back there, is the current independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And I'll make the point that I want to make in this way. If you read my reports between certainly 2001 and about 2007, basically they were narrative reports. They were quite readable, but they were not very technical. If you read Jonathan's reports...
Totally unreadable. Oh, no, sorry.
They involve far more legislative content, far more procedural content, because they have to, because the world has become a more complicated place. When I became independent reviewer, we were only concerned with Al-Qaeda in reality. And then ISIS came on the scene, and then, now we're into right-wing extremism. When I started the first part of the Prevent Review that was then taken up by Shawcross after I was litigated out of a job, at that time, both he and I were of the view that right-wing extremism, they were just hoodlums. They were ordinary criminals. They weren't capable of causing an immense amount of trouble. And yet a short time later, we've had what we've experienced here and has been replicated in other countries.
And a key theme of your book is the need to promote resilience within institutions. And this, for me, is one of the biggest challenges in that you could look at the far right and see that institutionally, they were kind of on their backside in the organisations becoming defunct. But it was clear that the way that social media works, the fluidity of channels meant that you could gather people together so much faster than in previous years or decades would have needed, phone calls and membership.
Technology, totally empowered by technology. And as this year's group heard me saying on Monday, I gave an example which I raised this afternoon in Parliament, which is that there are advertising organisations like Channel 3 Now in Pakistan, which have no interest in politics whatsoever. They've simply monetized themselves so that they will take advertisements from anywhere, whatever those advertisers say. And one of those advertisers, through Channel 3 Now, grossly misrepresented the identity and nature of the person who committed those tragic and horrible murders, allegedly, I should say, murdered, I don't think he's denied it, all those murders in Southport of small children. And that's made life much more complicated. Jurisdictionally, it's complicated because it's very difficult to deal here in London with people who are working in an online entity in Islamabad, and also investigatively complicated because bringing the evidence together is such an enormous challenge. And that challenge, unfortunately, and I say this not just myself, but I heard a Conservative peer saying it in the House of Lords this afternoon, that challenge has been worsened by the fracturing of the joint working arrangements in Europe that we used to enjoy between police forces and intelligence agencies in the European Union when we were members of it before Brexit. So it has become a more difficult and more complicated world. And I just hope and pray actually, that this government, which has some people in it who have some real experience of dealing with these issues, will make a major effort to ensure that there is far more cooperation between the various organisations and entities who are all willing to cooperate, and particularly international cooperation.
I think one of the things that we have to do is shed ourselves of the old thinking about what a threatening organisation looks like. It needn't, if you looked at the latter days of the British National Party, you would come to the conclusion the far right is not a threat. I mean, there's no organisation. Who are these people who claim to be in charge of it? That's not where the threat is. The threat, it's I won't use the word leaderless, because there are some serious influencers, but it's an influencer-led series of relationships. And what the internet, of course, has done famously is abolish time and space. So it's as if the events in the United States are happening next door. It's happening at the same time in almost virtual real time. And that changes the dynamics of how people come together and imagine themselves being part of a movement. I use the glib phrase, the great replacement, but it's just one way of trying to get yourself into the minds of people who individually in their communities are of no significance whatever. But if they're all connected together electronically, they can begin to think of themselves as a serious movement. And that clearly has happened in the United States with at least some parts of the MAGA movement.
The final issue I wanted to touch on before we open out the conversation was over the coercion and intimidation of the democratic process. It was a core theme of the review which I was asked to conduct for the last government, which this government is still considering. I managed to get it out 24 hours before the election was called, thank goodness, otherwise it would be probably never going to see the light of day. But it was clear that there had been a darkening of the climate in ways in which MPs in particular, and many councillors were being intimidated over over Gaza and the UK's policy towards that conflict. And I think it's important that while the focus has understandably been on the riots since they happened in August, that we don't lose sight of how serious a challenge that was. But interestingly, it was a challenge that fell largely below the threshold of violent extremism, which has got to part of the nexus of the problem with, I guess, yourself devising the contest strategy as a strategy to counter violent extremism. How do you think that the state agencies should be able to prioritize and counter that kind of activity when clearly violent extremism, as we've seen, also remains a real threat?
I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer. I've always drawn a distinction between thinking and doing. In a free country, we have the right to think what we want to think. One would hope that education would lead us to be in a position where people take reasoned views before just jumping into extreme positions. But, as I remember saying at one point to the police service, you're not responsible for policing Britishness. You're not responsible for policing a view of what in British society we would consider to be reasonable behaviour. You're there to be responsible to the law. And, in the democratic process, we end up with our black letter laws, which lay down those boundaries. And it gets very difficult and it's messy, particularly if you take environmental protests, some of which are quite likely to become violent, particularly if they're getting in the way of people who are trying to go about their business and find that the motorway is blocked. And we've managed our way through that, and good, sensitive policing, we've managed our way through that. But it's always going to be a problem of people who feel so passionately about a cause. But that is, in my view, different from those who are incited to go beyond the law. So gathering outside the private home of a member of Parliament is, I think, a reprehensible thing to do. It's not necessary to do it. Points can be made in other ways. Would you arrest and lock up people for doing it? You've got to be able to demonstrate that they've gone beyond.
You do, but my big concern, and let's open it, and I'm interested in what you think as well, so we will open it up in a moment. My big concern on this is that actually, quite quickly, that adds up to a strategic attempt to coerce decision makers in an unacceptable
That's
way.
an empirical question you're asking. Does it? And so I think there's a theoretical possibility that it could do that. But I think this is where you have to look at is there evidence that that is becoming a systematic matter that Parliament should actually address through legislation, protecting, say, the private lives of members of Parliament. That's not a route I would recommend anyone going down until you really have to. I feel free to disagree.
Let's open up the conversation on this, or indeed any matter that we've discussed in the last half hour, or has been a burning issue inside you for some time that you just can't wait to get out. I'm going to take. I'm not going to take 3 men to ask the first question. We may be 3 men on the front of here, but I can do something. And at the moment, as always, it's only the men who have their hand up. So,
Do you want to start with Dean
yeah.
and then Freddie, and then while they're thinking?
Yeah, Dean and Freddie.
Thank you. So we've.
Could you say for the room who you are and anything you think is relevant to your position as a question asker?
Yeah, okay, no problem. So my name's Dean Hayden. I was the Senior National Coordinator for UK Police Counter-Terrorism. Left 2 years ago, and I'm actually talking to the group tomorrow. So I think looking around the room, I'm actually the only ex-police officer in the room. So I'm going to stand up and defend policing for the moment. But my question comes back to the riots, actually, and interesting listening to the conversation that we heard about policing, we heard about the judiciary, we heard about prisons, which I would argue is actually the response to the riots. And my question actually is, and I'll add a little bit to this before I kind of, come to yourselves, but my question is around trying to understand the actual root causes to why the riots happened in the first place. So if I come back to 2011, for instance, and you've mentioned the riots in 2011, and in fact at that stage I was the head of Trident, Operation Trident, which was the armed team that actually shot Mark Duggan in London. And that was the catalyst for the riots across the country in 2011. So we understood the catalyst. But then, of course, at that stage, there was a whole host of different reasons, underlying root causes of why the riots actually spread across the country. And then when I come to the most recent riots, of course, we had the murder of the 3 young children in Southport, which absolutely was the catalyst for the riots across the country. But of course, there's a whole kind of underlying, again, root causes for why the riots spread across the country. It wasn't just the murder of the 3 children. There was a whole host of different reasons. And my question comes back to, I suppose if I push it back to politicians, the government, and let's call it the wider system, do we collectively understand the root causes of why the riots happened this time? And are we doing enough to understand and actually address those root causes? So I understand the policing, judiciary and prisons, but I just want to kind of get to the bit before around, do we understand the root causes, why it happened, and question, are we doing enough?
That's do you want to stop?
I think my short answer to your question, Dean, is no, we don't fully understand the root causes because I think they're very complex and I think quite a lot of work needs to be done. For example, we do not know why so many people were radicalised during lockdown. We don't know the way in which the internet developed over the last 3 or 4 years, because although we know it was developed and there are organisations connected with government that remove some terrorist sites, in fact in quite large numbers, from the internet, we don't know why those developments are taking place. We don't know why in Hungary, to take a random example, a right-wing government has been as successful politically as it has, which nobody who knows Hungary would have predicted 15 or 20 years ago. And we don't know why so many young people went to those riots, because they were disaffected. And we absolutely don't know why so many apparently respectable, middle-aged people took place in those riots, which one would not have expected. So your question is right, but I don't think we've got an answer to it. More work needs to be done on that. I would say, and you're right, we didn't say enough about the police. I think the police, in the circumstances, did an exceptionally good job. You would have been pleased to hear what Bernard Hogan-Howe said this afternoon in Parliament about that. And I think the police have actually won some pretty big stars for the way they dealt with it. Because as you say, the rest of the legal system is doing the mopping up afterwards.
Thank you. Would you like to add?
I agree with Alex. I don't think we do understand all the factors. It's probably a mistake to talk about root causes. Because that implies that you can find something, let's call it inequality or immigration, and blame it all on that. I think it's a series of social influences which happen to come together. The point I was making earlier is that we're not alone in the UK in having these forces act on us. The social media amplifies. I don't want to exaggerate the role of external actors like the Russian secret services, but there's no doubt that you do get exploitation when fissures are seen in society. That's when the bots appear, that's when the material gets reproduced. But the fissures are pre-existing. Mention was made earlier of the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which I take some credit for setting up. But the point was you needed to get everyone in the same space who has a contribution to make from the different intelligence services, from the police service, from government departments, and really get them to work on this. And over time, we began to understand what was going on with the extreme jihadism. But even after 9/11, we didn't really understand the ideological foundations of Al-Qaeda. And as we saw with ISIS, and indeed the franchises which are springing up and prevalent, particularly in Africa, it hasn't gone away. It really hasn't. So I think it would behove us now to invest in some serious work, including empirical work, to get to the bottom of the circumstances behind that particular loss of control of law and order in the UK. But
a word of caution in all this. I think, everything we've been talking about is the sort of thing that attracts, well, something's got to be done. We've got to improve the situation. Government has got to take more control. But we have got to be very careful that we don't try and over-control. We have to be very careful that people we don't like, who we really don't like because of their views, are not cast as extremists just because we really don't like their views. There are some subjects which it is almost impossible to have any form of conciliation over between opponents. Actually, the Israel-Gaza situation is one which has almost become impossible to discuss over a lunch or dinner table if people do not happen to agree about it. The issues in America, at least, about abortion and pro-life, again, are almost impossible to discuss. And there is a danger of, and this was when he was DPP, one of Keir Starmer's favourite words, overreach. The danger of overreach by government and the control authorities is something we must be extraordinarily wary of.
Back there.
Thank you. I'm a former fellow of the CEG. and I also work for the Labour Party. But my question specifically, again, related to the riots, is about the fact that the language that was used by government at the time. So Keir Starmer didn't really use the word terrorism. I thought it was quite interesting, specifically with regards to the attack on the migrant centre, because there was clear threat of violence there. That there was obviously considerations about terror-related crimes in response to the violence. Why was that threshold to use the word terrorism kind of not met, I guess, from decision makers within government? Was it something to do with the post-structural element of the riots that we saw with the far right organising on apps like Telegram and other encrypted messaging services? And if it was to do with that specific element that's kind of new and dynamic, I guess, to the counter-extremism world, is there a conversation to be had about how governments use or enforce their powers to stop these apps from taking hold, for instance, in the organisation of far-right extremists?
We'll take, as you, Catherine, as you're there, will you, no, go back, as you're there, we'll take the lady to your right, and then we'll come down. We'll take three. We'll take three.
No, I don't know. Jonathan, was your hand up?
No?
So down to him, then it's your hand, sorry.
Yeah, and we'll take those three.
Sorry. My name's Helen Worrell. I'm a journalist at the Financial Times. I just had a question regarding what you said, David Omand, about having drawn a distinction between thinking and doing. And I wanted to ask you about this very specifically in reference to Prevent, because one of the consistent criticisms has been that it does seek to police what people are thinking and might do, rather than as opposed to what they have done. And I just wondered, especially given what Lord Carlile said about overreach, potentially, whether or not you thought we had the balance right with Prevent at the moment. Thank you.
Great. And
Hopefully it's on. Yeah. Hi, Duncan Gardam. I'm another journalist, apologies, writing about terrorism for the Times and others. I just had two separate questions, I'm afraid. One for Alex, whether the Prevent review, the Shawcross review, had really underestimated the threat from far-right terrorism, given that there had been at least a couple of years of a large number of arrests and a great mention of the Great Replacement theory in these cases that David was talking about, and whether that review should have taken the far-right threat more seriously. And then for David, really, a question about social media and whether we're in a slightly invidious position now where we're getting help from these social media companies to identify culprits, which means it's difficult to actually clamp down on the content that the social media companies are carrying, and whether there's a way of cutting that Gordian knot, if that makes sense. Thanks.
thorny questions. Do you want to start?
Let me just pick up the thinking and doing distinction. Where individuals have thoughts, you or I, that is one thing. Where we are planning to take action in the real world that will affect potentially ourselves and other people, that's another. So conspiracy to cause explosions is certainly, you can say that, well, that's thinking, but it's more than thinking. It's actually taking a view potentially into the real world. So I'm not saying that if you were implying that I was making a distinction, you can, as it were, think how you would commit a serious offence. If you are genuinely thinking about how you're going to commit that offence, and that can be demonstrated, particularly if you're doing it with others in a conspiracy, then you're going to fall foul of the law. My point is really about trying to avoid a situation where the thought police are coming in to try and identify people with impure thoughts. The Prevent programme doesn't fall into that trap, in fact. It is a voluntary program, and where individuals are reported, for example, by teachers, it's because they have actually gone over that threshold. Now, whether that requires the sanction of the law, I personally rather doubt, but that's the distinction I wanted to make. And I think, in a democracy, it's quite an important one to actually maintain. The social media, I don't have an answer. I really don't. When I read that Elon Musk has said, the civil war is coming, and it started here, you just sigh and say, how very dangerous that is, because he has a huge following, and what an unreasonable thing it is to say, because it's clearly nonsense. I think we will have to take the 23 Act and really start to try and implement it and make it work. It's not going to be perfect, but most of the major social media companies do cooperate with the authorities when lives are at risk, and there is provision for the American companies to assist us, for example, and they're not breaking US law in so doing, where lives are at stake, and they are helpful. But the social, where you get these outlying views by individuals who are not sensitive to feelings of shame when their views are put out in public, I don't know what you do about that.
The first question about the behaviour of the rioters. In legal terms, I have absolutely no doubt that some of the rioters committed acts which fall within the definition of terrorism under UK law. And when I was asked to comment on that, when asked to comment, I regard myself as a messenger, and I thought it was right to send out the message that people could be prosecuted for terrorist offences for what they did in the riots. I absolutely support the discretion of the Director of Public Prosecutions to make a qualitative decision as to whether the acts complained of should be prosecuted as terrorism offences or as non-terrorism criminal offences. And I can see a justification for making the latter decision. But there is no doubt in my mind that some of the acts were terrorist acts, and there may be cases where terrorist offences should be prosecuted. Not everybody in this room agreed with me about that, but that's the way of the world. Prevent, the balance of prevent. I spent a lot of time on my abortive and not produced report of Prevent, and took a great deal of evidence with a fantastic team of civil servants and researchers who brought the material together. And I was left in absolutely no doubt that Prevent serves a useful purpose, and that much of the criticism of Prevent is what is unbalanced, the criticism. Much of the criticism was based on examples of bad references, for example, by teachers, to Prevent. But how many people, Dean, are questioned by the police and never charged with a criminal offence? It's quite a lot, isn't it? And the same, it's just the same for Prevent. And I think it's outrageous to criticise Prevent because a teacher or a university lecturer has referred someone to Prevent, which, as David said, is voluntary anyway, and it's been erroneous. These things happen, just like the police question and arrest wrong people from time to time. So I think the Prevent balance is about right. It's always going to be controversial particularly as there is a cohort of academics who are actually more campaigners than academics and are vehemently opposed to the whole notion of prevent. The question about whether William Shawcross's review should have paid greater attention to right-wing extremism. Well, what I will tell you is that I had almost reached my conclusions when I was judicially reviewed out of completing the Prevent review. And I, at that stage, was in exactly the same state of mind as on right-wing extremism as William Shawcross was later. Now, so when I had considered the evidence was not that right-wing extremism was in any way comparable as a threat to Islamist extremism and particularly Islamist terrorism. So I think I would support what William said if he was looking at the same evidence as me.
And therefore it was a problem that actually in latter years you'd had more referrals for right-wing extremism than Islamist extremism. It suggests either an over-reporting or I would instinctively think an under-reporting.
I think what it suggested actually, you know, the review of Prevent, both by me and particularly by William, was very evidence-based, very analytical. And one of the things that we had to look at was the way in which Prevent references were dealt with in so-called channel panels. And when I was doing my Prevent review, I thought they functioned on the whole very inconsistently around the country. And part of the problem was that the way in which cases were considered at the level of decision-making as whether they should go into Prevent was the unreliable part of what was happening. The final point I wanted to make in answer to those very good questions, and it relates to something that was raised by David, mentioned by David too, is that I repeat my caution about going too far in controlling content and thought. But social media providers must be made to realize that their moderation capacity of the content of their sites is too inadequate, and that the standards which they apply have failed. And they have to face the prospect that if they do not get their house in order voluntarily, which I would much prefer, they will face regulation, nation state by nation state, and some of them, like I think it's X in Brazil, will find themselves just taken off the airwaves, taken out of the ether in that country. So I do think there's a very heavy responsibility. And you know, this also applies to Elon Musk, actually, to get their house in order and understand that megalomania is not a good business model.
Could I just add a bit on the I was Security Minister for 3 years and Counter-Terrorism Minister for 3 years, and I've just been a member of the OSCT up until the election. The OSCT report on right-wing, on the right-wing concerns and issues very clearly states it had been underestimated. I've got to be careful what I say because we're quite constrained, but it was quite clear that it was felt to be not as great a threat as Islamist extremism. Exactly as you said, but it had been underestimated in the past, and it was something that we did need to be concerned about. Also, there was a concern about other countries getting involved in, I'm going to be careful again, in actually encouraging it because they had a wish to cause problems to our structures within this country.
Exactly. Right, I think we have time for one more round of questions, and it's going to have to be fast. So I'll have Jonathan Hall, who has been name-checked a number of times and deserves probably the chance to...
And then I think, excuse me, Sam Hart, and then Suzanne, Sophie Marie, you'll have to argue over the microphone.
Oh, I mean, yes. I know my place as the chair of this. I will be absolutely be told by Catherine.
A comment and a question. The comment is.
Well, in case ever.
Jonathan Hall, Independent Review of Terrorism Legislation. I didn't know this at the time of the riots, and if I was asked, and I was asked, I didn't get this point, but I think now we know from the riots. The key thing with the riots was the speed of prosecuting and bringing people to court. So people could see this is the consequence. If those individuals had been charged with terrorism, it wouldn't have been so quick. And I think that's a sort of learning point that I picked up. The question to the panel is, can you talk a bit about information? So one of the problems, I think, for the consequence of the Southport attack was that there was an information gap, vacuum, which was filled by false speculation. How important is it in this sort of social media world to get more information out there? Because I personally wonder whether more information could have been put out safely without compromising any potential criminal proceedings. So I'm just interested in your comments on that.
We'll take the round.
Hello. Hi, my name is Seng Huai and I'm a current CEG fellow. So my question also relates to the far-right threat, and I was, I guess, relieved, if that's the right word, that it wasn't as big a threat as sometimes it's made out to be. But, you know, I was just thinking about countries like Germany, where it is a massive threat. And so why is it that, relatively speaking, we don't have such a big threat? Is it something in our... Because, you know, some politicians and some thinkers sort of say our political system is better. You know, we had Brexit. Somehow it acted as a sort of safety valve for this right-wing extremism. So do you think there's something in our political system or culture that means that we're doing something right? Or is it more that actually something is going terribly wrong over there? Thank you.
And finally...
We're going to ask two really quick questions. I'm not going to take your questions.
Okay, well, let's have both of them if they're like fast and the answers are fast.
Mine was just a quick question. I think the discussion touched on the... I was a fellow about 3 years ago, currently work for Ministry of Justice. So yeah, you've touched on the ever-changing nature of extremism and terrorism. I wondered how our intelligence services are responding to this, especially with so much going on at home and also abroad.
And I just wanted to add a reflection, really, which you could perhaps answer as a question, but it's not got a question in it, which I was thinking about Dean's question. What do we understand about what caused this? And my observation would be that we're not set up in a way that we would need to be to ask the right questions of the right people to understand this. Because really, you would need to go to all the people involved in the riots and say, what motivated you and what would motivate you not to do it? And to do that piece of work would be really complicated because it would require police services sharing information with academics, allowing, you know, bringing people together to talk about it. And my reflection would be, we hardly ever ask the right people in order to build the understanding. We kind of assume an understanding based on observation and rhetoric, but we're not set up properly to understand it. And I suppose one of my sort of deep conclusions from government is that we're not resourced to understand things properly, because it would take a lot of resource to do that project that I've just described. And I suppose I'd welcome your view on that.
Great.
Hopefully the brief answers can then turn into much longer conversations.
Yes. Yeah, because at this point, let's have your closing thoughts on these questions, bearing in mind that you are now actively keeping people from alcohol outside.
Okay. First question, Jonathan Hall. Yes, I think we should get out more information if we possibly can, but this is possibly an ex post facto conclusion. We've learned from these events that when somebody is arrested and there is a potential issue like this arising, actually the police probably need to tell the media who has been arrested and what their background is. But it has to be done with enormous care, because you can do terrible damage to an entirely innocent person if you give information about who has been arrested for what is an alleged offence. It was a really interesting and complicated question about political life and the responsibility and the responsibility of the political world, as I understood the question, for the disaffection that there is in some parts of society. And it's actually not really a question, it's a statement telling the political parties in this country that they need to address the concerns of young people in particular, so that they do not feel disenfranchised in the political world in which they live. The intelligence services, my view is that on the whole they do an exceptionally good job. They work very well together. In my time involved in issues relating to terrorism, I've spoken to intelligence services in several countries, including Commonwealth countries, and I believe the United Kingdom has a higher, if imperfect, level of cooperation than any of the other countries I've encountered. To Suzanne Rain's question, it's really interesting. If one has ever been involved in mental health work, and I have chaired a couple of mental health charities, including one very large one, you always have to have people with lived experience in your management group. Now, early on, when we were dealing with the outcome of Al-Qaeda and 9/11, government agencies, including the Home Office, were doing quite a lot of work with people with lived experience of being very seriously radicalized. It was heavily criticized, including at times, I confess, by me, and it was diluted. And I think probably we over-criticized it. If we are really going to understand people who have become very radicalized, let's go and ask them why. At this time, I can think of one organization, not based in London, which is led by somebody who was heavily radicalized, which has made an enormous difference to de-radicalizing people who that person need to learn from his experience. And his organization's experience has been sent out to various cities in this country to some effect. So we must be prepared to use lived experience, which, even you, Suzanne, have not had.
Quick point. The threat has two dimensions. One is the threat to individuals in our society being caught up in some atrocity. The other is the threat to society itself from a breakdown of social harmony and a cycle of response, of atrocity, response, vigilantism, people get their heads broken, martyrs are created, control of the streets becomes problematic. We've seen that in Northern Ireland as an extreme. So I would not underestimate the threat that the extreme right face in that second category, although in terms of the threat of individual atrocities, I think probably the Islamists have rather more scary ideas. On the intelligence services, to echo what Alex has said, we're very lucky in this country, not only in having highly professional services, but having a community that links them so closely to the police service. That is an unusual situation, for example, elsewhere, if you looked elsewhere in Europe. But what it does mean is that the 2016 Act, which was passed, allowing, if you like, digital gathering of intelligence, particularly from the internet and the digital world, is absolutely necessary, and it must be kept up to date. But if you really want to understand what's going on, you're also going to need human intelligence. And that is going to involve either undercover officers penetrating these groups or getting close enough to them to persuade members of those groups to spill the beans. These are dangerous, difficult kinds of operations, and they deserve public support. Undercover policing has got rather a bad name recently. But actually, if we really want to deal with these problems, that is what society has got to accept. And the police service in particular and the security service we have to have confidence in their ability to oversee extremely delicate operations in a sensible, mature way.
Sir David, that is a perfect note to end. Can I say thank you to you, to Lord Carlile, to a incredibly esteemed and well-informed audience for making this genuinely fascinating discussion. As Catherine says, I think we are to start straight away our reception just out of the downstairs. So please do stick around and keep up the conversation there. Thanks very much for coming, everyone. Thank you.